We now have some time for some questions, but I first want to acknowledge Antoine, who was Michael's son. As Neil says, we're all one big family. Is it Antoine Clark? Okay, Antoine Clark, who edited and helped us produce this video of Sophie. So we're tremendously grateful to him and for you calling on him to help us out. So, economic homogeneity, flattening the curve, and at what cost? What if the effect we saw a more ideal situation no longer holds at the ends of the curve in a real-life situation where we have poverty, food insecurity, no transportation, no electricity? What makes an intervention not work is the same as the determinants of inequity. And so, as we learned, it's the absence of differences, or it could be the presence of fairness. And in that, we're looking at equity effectiveness. So what are the ethics of and ethical aspects of defining equity, and who decides and who defines equity? And as Cecily talked about the political will, and we have the opportunity to engage in many processes. The SDGs are one, the environment and climate change are another, and these make excellent sense in terms of some of the intersectorality that we're seeing. And Sophie's talked about child mortality and the role of social determinants, especially under nutrition, which fits exactly into some of the other discussions we're having. So I don't know are there mics for questions? Does anybody have any questions for the speakers? So I have some, if you don't. So, Michael and Cecily, what are the ethical aspects of defining equity? What are the dilemmas when you say we want things to be equitable and deciding on fairness? If you think from a programmatic point of view, or you think from a research and development point of view, what are some of the dilemmas that cause you to pause and think?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we're calling for and have called for is universal health coverage, right? And on the surface, this goes back to that graphic, right? On the surface, universality sounds great, but it depends on how it's implemented, because the kids who are facing the hardest, are facing the greatest challenges to their health often need more than just what is the basic, or what, access to basic services. They actually need greater investment. They need a bigger leg up. They need more support. And I think that's one of the things that, from a policy point of view and an investment point of view on the part of government, is always the hardest argument to make with government, because particularly in developing world contexts, where they already don't have a health system, or not a very strong health system, and now you're saying to them, okay, we want you to build a health system, then we want it to be universal, and then, by the way, to reach the furthest geographically, to reach the community that you don't like and never liked and is marginalized within your own culture, to provide women with what they need, you're going to have to actually do more. So it's a tough ask. But that is the ethical ask. But it's not an easy fight, right? And it is a fight.
I can give a slightly different spin on the question, because I think it's really important. And again, I'm going to draw on the wisdom of my students, because I gave a series of workshops on ethics to these students, and it was basically the workshops were called Community Engagement and Ethical Research in Low Resource Environments. And half of the students were African, half were Canadian, as I said. And we had a very, very vigorous debate around what the cultural attributes were of this understanding of what equity was. And it was interesting because the class did not divide into Canadian versus African student at all, which was great. But it did divide along the line of cultural imperialists and the progressives who thought that, what they could apply in terms of an equity lens to issues around global health could be fairly applied. And so at the end of the day, there were some I think the whole class felt very concerned about the cultural context in which these definitions were taking place. And I don't think we can deny that there are nuances to any concept of equity. It's not just points on a graph. There's a great deal of uncertainty. But where the class did fall on as an entire class, which was talking about this was in itself a solution, and not coming necessarily with a prescribed interpretation of what the determinants of ethical health or equitable health actually were, but talking about it and allowing that process and that conversation to take place over time. Now, that kind of sounds very academic, and indeed it was, because I challenged them with saying, okay, well, how do you know where you're going? How do you know how to get there? And how do you know once you've arrived, unless you've got some kind of indicator? And that's where we came back to this whole issue of how culturally determined are the SDGs? How much are they, in fact, a reflection of Western values, of the values of the global North? Those questions are not answered at this point, and there is concern, and I think it's legitimate.
But I challenge you back a little bit in the sense that the SDGs, there was no question the MDGs were definitely a northern sort of construct that was applied. I will say that with the SDGs, far from perfect, right? I grant you that, but there was a much more bottom-up engagement in terms of at least identifying, if not the finite, granular goals themselves and the indicators themselves, which have now sort of been taken up by the UN process and governments and what have you, but the identification of sort of areas of focus and what have you, I think, was a fairly well-informed process in terms of being a bottom-up process and a lot of consultation. So for sure there's concerns, but at least I have to say that it was a better process and a more involved process than the last time out. And we just hopefully will get better with each effort at being this kind of tackling these big issues collaboratively, because we really have to actually figure out how to tackle these big issues collaboratively. We don't really have much of a choice anymore, to be honest. Like, we're really at the point where, we better figure out how to work better together, or there isn't going to be an us to work with, ultimately.
And I think that speaking of that and speaking of measurement, working together on these piles of indicators for the SDGs and the UN climate change and environment demands, these countries are going to be burdened with indicator measurement demand overload. So working together will be something that I think that some of the northern international NGOs can really take a stand on, as well as the research academic organizations, because this is massive and the capacity is not strong, and nor is there a lot of funding that goes to that part of the financing. Mm-hmm. So it's something that concerns a lot of people. Are there any questions? You've been sitting all day. Oh, great. And you'll have to use your outside voice or come and use the mic.
Can everyone hear me?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So I just had a quick question about the graph, the square graph that Mr. Clark used with the line of sustainability and the, thank you, and poverty.
Okay.
Sorry. So it was easy to see, no surprise, the countries that were on the right-hand side going up. There was the United States I could see in there, and Italy in that box, and then I could just, before it disappeared, I could see Brazil, no surprise, other countries in the lower. But the sweet spot,
None.
I couldn't see any present place in the sweet spot. And if you could just speak to what that might look like to be in the sweet spot, or if there is any place presently that falls into that sweet spot.
There is one country that comes very, very close. And in fact, if you blow up that graph, you can see its circle actually has a corner of that circle in that sweet spot. It's Costa Rica.
Interesting.
I mean, one of the things that, and some of the people who are more focused on environment in the room would probably be more aware of this SDG, but or this portion of the SDGs. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that the SDGs are challenging us to shift consumption. So, to your point, to lower consumption in the north and to increase sort of environmentally sustainable consumption in the global south. I'll tell you a funny story. I scared the pants off of the folks at Global Affairs Canada shortly after the SDGs were sort of finalized, when I pointed out to them that it was about a reformation. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't trying to take away or trying to destroy capitalism. That's not what the SDGs are doing. But it is a substantial challenge to capitalism and a reformation or attempt to reform capitalism. And the folks in the economic growth department or unit of GAC who were not, this was before inclusive came into the conversation, and it was before the new government, literally looked like they'd swallowed their tongues when I told them that. And I said, you need to read what that says and what that really means. And I don't know if we can get there. It's a pretty big jump, but that's sort of what it's trying to do. And we'll see if we can accomplish it.
It's interesting because that plot has not, of the HDI versus environmental footprint, has not been updated in a while. That, to me, would be a very smart way to track this over time. So I've got to go back and look and see where that data has come from, and see if we can't track that over the period of time. I think that would be a good indicator as we move Canada down into that sweet spot.
So what master's student wants to do a thesis?
Perfect. I'd be happy to supervise.
Are there any other questions? Oh, yes?
Question, for Save the Children. Are you maintaining the language of child survival or going away from it? And if you maintain it, why?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think we do talk about child survival. We don't exclusively talk about child survival. We talk about thriving as well, and we talk about, I mean, Save the Children responds across multiple sectors, right? We respond in health, in education, in protection, in what we call child rights governance, but that's engaging children in the lobbying of government and getting government to better fund and invest in children. And we respond in emergency settings and long-term development. And I'm proud to say 95% of our staff now, it's taken a while, but 95% of our staff in country are nationals from that country. So we're in the process of decolonizing our own work, which is good to see. So I don't think, yes, we talk about survival, but I don't think we exclusively talk about survival by any stretch. But did you have a particular challenge to me about why not use survival within the context of kids surviving to the age of 5? Or are you just wanting to know if we're using thrive more?
I'm becoming more allergic to the idea of child survival because we use them in certain part of the world, but not in other parts. And so if we are talking about children in general, I would prefer that we talk about the language that's inclusive, and then also that goes across the way we deal with the child development language than the survival.
I think
It's more than that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really valid point, and certainly Save the Children Canada is rebuilding our domestic program, and we're working a lot with Indigenous communities right now, and we are challenging ourselves around the kind of language we use and why we use some turns of phrase in some parts of the world and not in others. And I can say, we're 30 different sort of fun, Save the Children members is what we call them, but those are groups that both fundraise and do implementation work, or implement members, but we're in 120 countries total. And it is a challenge. Like we use the word, we talk about the fact that we talk about colonization, and we talk about the implications of colonization because of the relationships we're developing with Indigenous communities here. We've been asked to confront our own privilege and our own understanding of where we sit as a non-Indigenous organization within that relationship, and so, and not all Save the Children's are there yet. So to get language that transcends an international organization that is in 30 countries takes time, but there are pockets of that kind of work underway.
No, I just asked because you are the only children folks there, but it's a challenge even for myself because as a Congolese trained in North America, I use the same language, but I have to tell myself that maybe it's time for myself to change it, not necessarily just from those who come from the North. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
So I'm aware that there's a number of meetings happening right after this session, and I don't want to carve into those. So if there's any other questions, maybe you could come to the front and speak. Oh, you want? Well, as long as you say it's okay, it's okay. Okay,
yeah.
Don Sutherland.
Thank you. Just a couple of things interest me. First of all, we talk about like we are going to solve some problems out there. Like it's almost like a white woman's burden or something like that. And I think we have an issue in Canada, and maybe we should figure out how do we do something about the situation in Canada as our kind of first priority. Not so much to reduce the wealth of the wealthy, but just let's make some difference with respect to children and disadvantaged populations, and we've talked about them today. But I'd like to go back to the sweet spot question for a minute, because Costa Rica has fascinated me for a long time. And how did they get there, and how long it took,
No military.
and without a lot
No
of
military.
external help, mostly external, not interfering. So is there something we can still learn from the Costa Rican example? And are there others, Michael, that are close to the sweet spot who might further illustrate things we should leave alone and let it be solved there by people there? I mean, just so we don't mess up. Do you have any other suggestions about countries that are close to that sweet spot?
I fully agree with you, Don. Obviously, that there's no possibility, there's no way that external forces are going to be pushing those countries either one way or the other. That is entirely going to be driven by national energies and national priorities. It's interesting if you've been to Costa Rica and you talk to people. The best information that you can get about anywhere is from a taxi driver, right? So you talk to a taxi driver and you ask them, what's good about Costa Rica? He says, health, health. We got free health care. How come you have free health care? Because we have no army. They have no army, no military. All right? So deal with it, Canada. Figure it out. Yes, I mean, that's a pretty strange thing for us to consider. But nonetheless, that's certainly from Costa Rican taxi drivers in San Jose. That's what they'll tell you, that it's because they have no military. that they're able to progress and protect a large part of their environment. So who's moving in those directions? It's the usual suspect. I mean, the Scandinavian countries are certainly moving well into the highest HDI territory for sure. I still think they've got work to do on the environmental sustainability agenda. Canada is obscenely high up into that sour spot up in the top. But it is, I think, a useful indicator of how well or how well not we're doing. And I would push for it as a monitoring device.
And Don, you mentioned marginalized, vulnerabilized communities in Canada, especially children. And as we know, Canada has to report on our own progress. And so it'll be really important for us to make sure that we get the disaggregated information out there so it doesn't all get bundled up to a national report that says everything's just fine and well, thank you very much. So the role that we can play and the role that the minister responsible for Aboriginal First Nations affairs and health will be really important, I think, in the future. Sorry.
No, and I just wanted to say, so I talked a little bit about the fact that Save the Children Canada is sort of building a Canadian presence, and we will be applying that framework that I showed you. Actually, is the global campaign framework, and it will be applied within the context of our advocacy work here in Canada. But we're very conscious that we are a non-Indigenous organization, and so we have to take the lead from our Indigenous partners in terms of what parts of this agenda align with what their goals are. And so that's a piece of work that's going to be done over the next year, and because we can't speak for the Indigenous peoples of Canada, but we can be allies and we can leverage our campaign to hopefully help their efforts, and that's our goal this year.
Great, thank you, and thank you to you, Michael, and to Cecily, and to Sophie for speaking. We're thinking tomorrow at lunch, if anybody's interested in talking about these recommendations or some points coming out of the meeting that we would then send on to the government, we could have a table at lunch. Michael, you'll be here?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll just pick a table, and anybody who wants to gather around that and have a chat and see how we might move that idea forward, we can meet tomorrow. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the late afternoon and evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.